Okay, here we go. Are y'all ready? I'm going to get on our proper slide, and our proper slide would be about right here. Right here is where we're at. We've already talked about the prologue, yes? Yes, we did. The prologue of it. So on Exodus 20, look at verse number 1 and 2. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. We did discuss this prologue last time. If I'm looking at you, don't know. Y'all weren't here. Y'all were? Oh, they didn't go to the sunshine until after Sunday school. That's right. I forgot. All right, cool. I'm just jealous is all. Okay, so don't even mind me. All right. Anyway, and then we talked about how Christ was the fulfillment of the law, I think. And then I quoted J.V. Fesco, who said, may we remember that we need not fear the condemnation of the law because Christ has become a curse for us and has borne the curse of the law upon the cross. May we also love the law of God as it points us to the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ, in whose image we are being renewed. Let us therefore give thanks for the law of God and for Jesus Christ, who has fulfilled the law on our behalf. And so what I want to do right now is look at this bottom part, the Ten Commandments, and see how each commandment reflects God's character, because I told you about that. If the commandments reflect God's character and God's character never changes, do the commandments ever change? Do they ever go out of, I thought we were living under grace today. We're not under law, y'all. We're under grace. They complement each other, he says. Anybody else? I'm actually opening it up. Believe it or not. What if someone tells you we are not under the law, we are under grace? What does that mean? Have you? Huh?
Kind of like a license to
do whatever you want? Interesting. What if a well-meaning Christian says that and they're not just trying to, do whatever they want? Okay. So what does that have to do with the law then? So I'll say it again. You've heard this before, and all those answers are pointing to the right place. People sometimes will tell you, we're not under the law, we're under grace now. This is the age of grace. Of course it is. For salvation, yes. But why would you even need to say that? Salvation's never been under the law. You've never been able to earn it. I don't care if you're the Old Testament or New Testament, it doesn't matter. Salvation's always by grace through faith. That's never changed. I don't care what some people like Peter Ruckman and others say, that you're saved different in different time periods or different dispensations. Ultra dispensationalists like Schofield and all those guys. No. You're saved in the Old Testament the same way you're saved in the New Testament, by grace through faith. All right? So it's never been of works. So why would you even need to say, well, we're not under the law now, we're under grace? Well, salvation's always been under grace. It's not changed. So why would you even need to say that, right? I don't know. So when someone says that, you say, well, look, yes, as a means of salvation, we're not under law, we're under grace. But P.S., by the way, salvation's never been by the law anyway. If you're one of the people that believes that they were saved in the Old Testament by keeping the law, that's fine. I'm not going to have a dispute with you, not in Sunday school in front of everybody especially. But I don't believe that. I don't think the Bible points that out. I don't think people are saved differently in different times and different dispensations. Yes?
I've heard, I think Brother Harris has said, Jesus came to fulfill the law, not abolish it.
Yeah, that's what Jesus said. He said he came to fulfill the law and not to abolish the law. Exactly, right. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't mean to get off the subject. Let's stay on the subject here. The Ten Commandments come from God. God's character never changes. The Ten Commandments are a reflection of God's character. And so what does that mean, that the Ten Commandments tell us about God? They tell us what kind of a God he is. If you didn't know what kind of a God you're serving, and didn't know what kind of a God that you came to by faith through grace, then the kind of God that God is reflected in the Ten Commandments. So I'm just going to, I'm not going to read, we won't read every one of these verses because we're going to read them anyway. I'm just going to go through the list really quickly. Are you ready? So how each commandment, the first commandment, in verse number 3, where it says, have no other gods before me, is the first commandment shows that God is a jealous God. God is a jealous God, and he will not share his glory with anybody. The second commandment in verse number 4, when it says you can't make a graven image or any likeness or anything that's in heaven or under earth, that second commandment tells us that God must be worshiped in his way, not our own. And God can't be worshiped or fashioned as a metal object or as a concrete object or in the old days as a wooden object, that God is a spirit. The third commandment says, get out your little commandment things. How about that? And we'll look, this instead of reading the verses for time, you can look under your little commandment thing. And at the end of this, you're going to have a quiz and see if you can remember the 10 commandments, all right? So we're on the third commandment. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. This tells us that God is a God who expects to be honored, obeyed, treated with respect. Not only God himself, but even his name is holy. Lawbreakers will be held guilty, so God is also a God of justice, right? Because if you look at the third commandment, it says the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. So there's punishment implied there, right? You'll not just be, guiltless if you take God's name in vain. That's why I've said this many times before. That's why hearing people or in movies or TV shows saying God's name in vain, it just does something to me. It really does something to me, and it really disturbs me. And so that's why I will never watch another. I don't care if you're a John Wayne lover or not. I'll never watch another John Wayne movie as long as I live for his blasphemy against God in a movie and his saying God's name in vain and getting a kid to say God's name in vain at least 3 or 4 times. I'll never, I don't care. John Wayne is one of the things you do not mention if you're in a Baptist church, because he is worshiped by many independent Baptists. All right? So you don't say anything bad about John Wayne, right? Let's go on to the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What does this tell us about God's character? It says God is sovereign over all the events of our daily lives. He is Lord of every single day of the week. Fifth commandment on your card, honor thy father and thy mother. This says God has authority over us as a father. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. God is the Lord and the giver of life, but he's also the Lord and giver of death as well. And if you try to take that power into your hands by killing someone, you're taking upon yourself something that's only the prerogative of God, right? Look at, what are we on? Seventh commandment. Thou shalt not commit adultery. God is a God of purity and faithfulness, and he expects his covenants to be kept. And as God is a God of purity and faithfulness, God expects his children to be children who are pure and faithful. Will we ever be perfectly pure on this earth? No. Perfectly faithful? No. But that's what we should be striving for every day that we live. Not only in our personal relationships, in our marriage, but also in our relationship to God. Eighth commandment, look at that one. Thou shalt not steal. This tells us about God's character, that he is our provider, and everything ultimately belongs to God. So when you take something from somebody, right? So Laura I know she has some gum in her purse. She's not around, so I'm just going to grab some, right? And I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not going to tell her. That's stealing, right? But, it's okay because Laura knows. No. Theft is against God. It's not against Laura if I steal something from Laura's purse. It's not against her. Well, it is against her. But ultimately, it's against God, because he's our provider, and everything on this earth belongs to him. Look at the ninth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. This tells us God is a God of truth. He is true in all he says, and he is true in all he does, so we should not lie. Because God is a God of truth, and he's not a liar. We should not lie. And the 10th commandment, bless you, thou shalt, bless you again, not covet thy neighbor's house. This tells us that God is a provider. God gives us everything we truly need. He's our provider. We're not to covet. We're to have faith in God's providence. And when we covet, what we're saying is, God, it's what you've given me, it's not enough. I need more. And what you have seen in your wisdom fit to let me have, I think I know more than you because I need more than what you've given me, or something that you haven't given me, or whatever. I saw this amazing guitar like Monday or Tuesday. I'm like, whoa, I would really like to have that. And I'm like, well, I already got a guitar. I got 2. I don't need another one, right? I mean, who needs more than 2 guitars? Well, everybody. But anyway. No, it wasn't my neighbor's guitar. Thank you. But anyway, So the Ten Commandments also show another attribute of God, and that's love. Because the Ten Commandments are all about love. Love is the foundation, or you could say love is the foundation of the Ten Commandments. Turn to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. Matthew chapter 22. And I've got my handy-dandy Ten Commandments placekeeper, so I can use that. If you don't have ribbons, those of you peasants who don't have ribbons, here is your Ten Commandment ribbon, your placekeeper. Matthew 22, look at verse 37. Matthew 22, verse 37. Because, excuse me, one of the Pharisees says, hey, what's the greatest commandment? Of course, that's paraphrasing. All right, and then verse 37, Jesus answered that question. He said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor and as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So the Ten Commandments, which the Jews had expanded, and God gave the Jews many more commandments and precepts to keep for them religiously and ceremonially and judicially, right, their commandments. And so hundreds of them. All those, the Lord said, all those can be encapsulated not in 10, but in 2. Because there's 2 tables of the law in the Ten Commandments. One has to do with our relationship to God. One has to do with our relationship to our fellow man or our neighbor. And that's what Jesus said. Those are those 2 commandments. Love God with all thy heart, soul, and mind, and love thy neighbor as myself. And that is it, he said, right? The Ten Commandments can be summed up into those 2. So every commandment is about love. Because look at verse 37. You should love the Lord. That's the first 4 commandments. And then the next, you should love God. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I'm sorry. Yeah. If we take the first 4 being about God, then 5 through 10 are about your neighbor, because it starts with your father and mother on number 5. So anyway, they're all about love. Love God and love your neighbor. If you want to summarize the Ten Commandments into those 6 or 7 words, love God and love your neighbor. 6 words. So every commandment's about love. We love God by worshiping him, by using his name properly, as the Ten Commandments say, by honoring our parents, by being faithful to our spouses, by telling our neighbors the truth and not wanting something that belongs to them, by respecting their property. All these commandments can be summed up with the word love. Love is a basis. I've got a quote by Henry Drummond. Maybe you've heard of him. Anybody heard of Henry Drummond? Raise your hand. A couple of y'all have heard of Henry Drummond? Good. He was a Scottish evangelist in the late 1800s, right? And I just got given me a good book. Actually, it's a sermon by Henry Drummond that Miss Jernigan gave me, and I'm going to quote from it, right? So he says this. He says, you remember the profound remark which Paul makes saying love is the fulfilling of the law? Did you ever think what he meant by that? In those days, men were working the passage to heaven by keeping the Ten Commandments. They were working, right? And the 110 other commandments which they had manufactured. But Christ came and said, I'll show you a more simple way. If you do one thing, you'll do all these hundreds and all these other things, or you do these 10 things without ever thinking about them. If you love, you will unconsciously fulfill the whole law. You can readily see for yourselves how that must be so. Take any of the commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. If a man loves God, you will not have to tell him that he should not have no other gods. Love is the fulfilling of that law. What about the commandment, take not his name in vain? Would a man ever dream of taking God's name in vain if he loved God? You don't have to tell a man who loves God, hey, don't take God's name in vain, is what he's trying to say. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Would he not be too glad to have one day in 7 to dedicate more exclusively to the object of his affection, and that's God? Love would fulfill all these laws regarding God. In this way, love is the fulfilling of the law. It's the rule for fulfilling all rules. The new commandment for keeping all the old commandments. Christ's one secret of the Christian life. And that's why he says that here in Matthew, that love. So God is also, the Ten Commandments tell us, God is a God of love. He wants us to love him. He wants us to share his love with others. So the Ten Commandments reveal God's character, his sovereignty, his jealousy, his justice, his holiness. They reveal his honor, his faithfulness, his providence, his truthfulness, and ultimately they reveal God's love. Well, when I read the Ten Commandments, I don't see God's love. Well, that's because you're not reading them correctly, right? So God is a God to love, and he wants us to love him and share his love with others. Isn't that what he says here in Matthew? He wants us to love him, and he wants us to share his love with other people. I think that's another way you could summarize the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments reveal all that about God's character. Now, God is the opposite of all these commandments, right? That's why they are prohibited. The ones that are prohibited and the ones that are conjoined. In other words, you should do this, like keep the Sabbath day. But even that has prohibitions behind it. But God is the opposite of all these. Murder is wrong because God's not a murderer. Adultery is wrong because God is pure. Stealing is wrong because God's not a thief. Lying is wrong because God's not a liar. The Ten Commandments reveal the moral character of God, and they tell us about God. Why in the world will we want to ignore them? Do you know everything you need to know about God? I don't think so. I didn't ask for a show of hands. I didn't want to embarrass anybody. You and I don't know anything close to what we need to know about God. How could we ignore the one thing that tells us probably the most about God than anything else in the Bible? Let's go on to the next part. Are you ready? What the Ten Commandments reveal. Hold on. Where did I go? There you go. Implications of the character of God's character in the law. Number one, breaking God's law assaults his character, right? If the Ten Commandments reveal the character of God, breaking the Ten Commandments means we're assaulting God's holy character. It's almost as if we were making a direct assault upon God himself when we break one of the commandments. To worship another God is we're denying God's sovereignty. We're saying, you're not sovereign. I don't believe that. To misuse God's name is to deny God's honor. To steal is to deny God's providence, and on and on and on. When we break the Ten Commandments, we are denying the character of God. And if you want to put it in stronger words, we're actually assaulting God's character. Every violation of the law is an offense against God's holy character. And the second implication of God's character in the law, and we said this already, God's law never changes. If the Ten Commandments reflect his character is the fancy theological word is it's immutable. That means it cannot change, right? It never changes. It's a word I would never use to describe my wife, immutable, never changing, right? Because it depends on the minute or the half minute or the quarter minute or whatever, right? So God's law is a reflection of his character. His character is immutable, never changes. And the law has existed since the garden. The Ten Commandments were a summary or a republication of the law. That law will never change. It'll never go out of style, for our society, it's gone out of style, right? But it will never change. So let's look at some principles of interpreting the Ten Commandments really quickly, all right? I think this is interesting. You may not think this is interesting. That's fine. Turn to Romans 7. Just go forward a few pages to Romans chapter 7. And how to interpret the Ten Commandments. You say, well, Brother Chris, seems pretty straightforward to me. It is pretty straightforward, but let's go over just a few things. In considering each of the commandments, we need to keep in mind these rules, all right? Are you ready? One is look here on the chart. One is the inside-out rule. The Ten Commandments are internal as well as external. Isn't that what the Lord Jesus Christ said in Matthew chapter 5? He says, you think you've kept the law by never committing adultery, an actual physical act of being with another woman who wasn't your wife physically. Jesus said, no, you think that's all that it takes for you not to have committed adultery? He said, no, if you've lusted after a woman in your heart, you've committed. So it's obvious that the Ten Commandments are internal as well as external. Because when you take that commandment, do not commit adultery, you think of external things. Do not go and have relations with another woman who is not your wife. But the Ten Commandments are internal. In other words, the Ten Commandments demand inward holiness as well as outward obedience. I like that statement so much, I'll repeat it. I quote Brother Chris. He said, I'm always quoting people. Why not? He said this, and I thought this was good, and I wrote it down. He said, the Ten Commandments demand both that we have inward holiness as well as outward obedience. So look, what's that? That's Brother Chris. If it's a quote, I'm going to attribute it. Do I not attribute enough quotes for you to understand that if it's a quote, I attribute it? I got it from the book of Brother Chris. What do you want? I don't know what you want from me right now. But by the way, if you do not have one of these, you're not allowed to interrupt. That's one of the things you get in the VIP package. which you obviously have not bought. And by the way, they're not transferable from spouse to wife. Because I know your husband has one, they're non-transferable. It says at the bottom, non-transferable. Okay, can we look at Romans 7 instead? Romans 7, instead of people grilling me. Paul says this, and there's so much depth here, we can't even touch any other verses. We'd be here all day. Romans 7:14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Now what he says here is the law is spiritual. That's what I'm trying to say. The law deals with our inward souls as well as our outward bodies, right? It deals with inward holiness. Our outward obedience should be the result of our inward love for God. Because what you have in is manifested by, what comes out is manifested by what you have inside. So go back to Exodus 20. Did you leave your marker there, your 10 Commandments at Exodus 20? It might be good to leave your 10 Commandments marker where the 10 Commandments are. It's just a thought. All right. Exodus, it's not after Numbers, it's before Numbers. It's after Deuteronomy. All right, Exodus 20. Look at verse 17. Can you go to verse 17? All right. Past the 10 Commandments to verse 17. Finishing the 10 Commandments at verse 17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Now this has nothing to do with action, does it? Nothing at all. This has to do with, now the previous commandments, look at verse 13, killing. Verse 14, committing adultery. Verse 15, stealing. Verse 16, bearing false witness. So previous commandments deal with action. But this commandment deals with our affections, internal, right? So what's true of the 10 Commandments is actually true of all of them. What's true of this 10th commandment, let me say it like that, is true of all of them. They require both inward and outward obedience, right? That's why when the young ruler came to Christ and said, what do I have to do to be saved? And Christ says, you know the 10 Commandments. And he listed some of the 10 Commandments. And the rich young ruler goes, hey, good news, I've done all those. And I've criticized him for years saying he's a hypocrite because he just lied. So he already broke that one, right? According to his understanding, being a Jewish, religious Jew at the time, he had kept the 10 Commandments. Because according to the religious Jews at the time, the 10 Commandments were outward, not inward. So had he kept the 10 Commandments? By his understanding, yeah, he wasn't lying. By his incorrect understanding, he had kept the 10 Commandments because that was the incorrect understanding that the Jews had turned the commandments into things you do. But Christ set them straight in Matthew chapter 5. Early on in his ministry, he said, no, you guys have it all wrong. It's not what you do that allows you to keep the commandments. It's partly what you do, but it's also what you guys are missing. It's inside as well, right? So he reinforced the spiritual aspect of the law during the Sermon on the Mount. Because the religious Jews by that time were experts concerning the law. They even knew how many sticks you could pick up on a Sabbath before you broke that law of keeping the Sabbath, right? Could you pick up 2 sticks or 3 sticks? What if the stick were 2 inches from the fire? They had laws for everything, right? They were ultra legalists, right? Now we, independent Baptists, we have laws about how long your hair should be and stuff like that, or whatever. But anyway, Christ reinforced in Matthew 5 the spiritual aspect of the law. Jesus said adultery was not only outward physical act, inward sinful desires. Murder, not only the outward act, but also anger and hatred as well. And anger and hatred don't have to be manifested. They can just stay inside. I got people that I'm angry with that I'll probably never tell them that because it wouldn't do any good, right? But that's internal, right? That's spiritual. So that's one thing we need to remember about when we go through each of these commandments. It's not only talking about an outward physical act, it's talking about inward spiritual. They require inward holiness as well as outward obedience, right? And second thing, positive and negative, the rule of positive and negative. Every commandment has 2 sides, both positive and negative. You think that they're all negative, but they all have both sides. Take theft, for example. Where a sin is forbidden, theft, the opposite behavior is required. So if it says, thou shalt not steal, bless you, that's the quietest sneeze I've ever heard. Don't feel like you have to internally, because no. It's not healthy to keep your sneeze. Yeah, it's not. So let it out. It's all fine. All right. If it gets problematic, I'll say something. Don't worry about it. Every commandment has two sides. Well, so where the sin like theft, you should not steal, all right? That's negative. Don't do this, right? But every commandment has a negative aspect and a positive aspect. Where the negative thing is forbidden, like theft, the exact opposite is required, okay? So when the Bible says thou shalt not steal, it also means, what you should do is you should be generous. That's the opposite of that. And I'll show you some scriptures to support what I'm saying here. Where a behavior is required, honoring your father and mother, the opposite, the negative, is forbidden. So if the commandment says positively, I'm to honor my father and mother, then what's the opposite of that? That's sinful. Not honoring your father and mother. You're kidding me, really? Wow. I'm not going to honor the bell. How about that? So the opposite, not to show them honor, that is forbidden. So when a commandment requires something that you shouldn't do it, the opposite of that is what you should do. When a commandment says, like honor thy father and mother, you should do something that's positive, then the opposite, the negative, is also forbidden. Does that all make sense? There's a positive and a negative aspect. Look at the third commandment, if you got your handy-dandy little chart here. Third commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That's a negative commandment. You should not do this, right? Negatively, it forbids using God's name wrongly. But Brother Chris, you just said it also has a positive. Every commandment has a positive aspect. Yes, it does. If the third commandment says negatively, you should not use God's name wrongly, then on the positive side, you should use his name with reverence and respect and love. Does that make sense? All right, let's go to the third one. And I'll go, like every time we hit a commandment, I'll remind, and we'll go through each one of these. Third, sorry about that. I'm getting lost here. The rule of categories. Look at all this color I put. That's pretty. All right, the rule of categories. Each commandment stands for a whole category of sins, not just the one sin that the commandment talks about, right? Each commandment stands for, and again, a lot of this stuff, we can go to Matthew 5 and other places. I can prove this to you, but right now I'm just stating this stuff, right? Each commandment stands for a whole category of sins, not only the specific sin, and Jesus said this when he talked about murder especially, not just the specific sin, don't murder someone, but all the sins that lead up to that sin are also forbidden. Anything that leads to that sin is forbidden. Let's do the one about adultery. That's a negative command. The seventh commandment, don't commit adultery. But it encompasses more than just the outward physical act of adultery. As we said with the first thing, it also deals with the things internally. And number three that I'm saying to you, there's a whole category of sins it forbids. All the acts which lead up to adultery are sinful. Flirting is sinful. Talking with someone privately and secretly without your spouse's knowledge, intentionally keeping him in the dark. I'm not talking about, I talk with Audrey's sister privately about what should I get her for her birthday, and she's got ideas. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Texting someone who's not your wife secretly and sharing personal stuff, right? A multitude of sins have been committed before the physical act of adultery is committed. So what I'm trying to say is the whole category of those sins are also forbidden. I'll read you a quote by Philip Ryken, who said this. He said, using these principles, even the simplest commandment places overwhelming demands on our obedience. He quotes somebody else here. He says, the sins forbidden in the ninth commandment are prejudicing the truth, the good name of our neighbors, as well as our own, giving false evidence, suborning false witnesses, appearing to plead for an evil cause, overbearing the truth, that means overstating the truth, passing unjust sentence, calling evil good, calling good evil, rewarding the wicked according to the work of righteousness, and the righteous according to the work of the wicked, forgery, concealing or hiding the truth, keeping silent when you should say something, holding our peace when iniquity calls for reproof, complaining to others, speaking the truth, but speaking it in a not good season, maliciously. I could go on and on. Do you see all the category of sins that are forbidden by that one sin? And that's only what is forbidden. That's only the negative side. We haven't even gone to the positive side of that commandment. So that's what we're trying to say. That's what I'm trying to say here. Each commandment stands for a whole category of sins, not just the specific sin, but all the sins leading up to it. And then the last one, we'll have to probably finish on this one, the law of the tables. So we've talked about there are two tables of the commandments. The first four, look on your handy dandy card. The first four have to do with our relationship to who? God. And then starting with verse number 5. Now I know, and as a kid you know too, it's really cool when Moses in these pictures is holding the 10 Commandments. You got 5 on one side and 5 on the other. I get that. And I don't know how they were actually placed on there. If there's a verse that tells us there were 5 on one table and there are 5 on the other, then that's fine. If you show it to me, I'll believe it. So I got no problem with that. It's no big deal to me. I really don't care. But we know that the verse 4 have to do with our relationship to God. And what do the next 6 have to do? Our relationship with our fellow man, right? So here's the, and this is not going to come up as much as 1, 2, and 3 are going to come up, but here's the idea of the law of the tables. The first table that Moses held in his hand, or Charlton Heston, whoever it was, the first table he held in his hand, the first 4 commandments always take precedence over the other 6. Okay, that doesn't come up much. It's not going to, but our duty to God in the first 4 always governs or dictates our duty to the others in the last 6. So if your parent, it says honor your parents. What happens if your parents, and you're a Christian kid, if your parents tell you to worship a false god? Should you do it? Well, hold on, but the commandment says honor your parents, y'all. Y'all are disobeying that. I can't believe y'all. I'm trying to give you this and you can't even obey the one commandment that says honor, commandment 5, honor thy father and thy mother. Y'all can't even keep that. Why not? Because the first table takes precedence. It doesn't go against. Let's not put them in opposite to each other. Doesn't go against. But I understand what you're saying. I'm not mad at you. The first table takes precedence over the second anytime there is a conflict, which there is not a lot, but I've given you one example of that, right? So anytime there's a conflict, the first table is always going to have precedence over the second. Let's turn to, this is the last verse. Let me just read it, because if we turn, it'll take y'all a long time to get there, and I'll feel like I have to wait for y'all, because I'll feel guilty, and then I'll feel guilty for not even getting there, and y'all are already there, and so I'm going to read you from the book of Acts. I got to do this quickly because we got to close. And the book of Acts, and this is, of course, this is, I'm sorry. This is Peter. This is Peter. Peter preaching. Are you ready? Acts chapter, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to turn there. Saying, did we not straightly command you that you should not teach in his name? These are the people that punished him. And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Shout out, his blood is already on you. Verse 29. Then Peter, I guess I could have gone to that verse to see who's talking here. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. That's the principle Peter was applying here. That's why Christians are obligated to ignore or refuse or comply with a law of the government that violates one of the first 4 laws. So if you really felt, and we're not going to talk about this, believe me, not trying to divide a church, but if you really felt that that after a while you're seeing how things are working with COVID, and it's not like they told us, surprise, surprise, believe the scientists, it's not like they told us, and it's not what they said it was going to be, and we're thinking, you know what, we should get back to worshiping, and we did as a church, we got back to worshiping together. If you felt that way, then maybe it's because you thought that the first commandment, obeying God, was more important than obeying man or man's law, right? If there's a conflict between the two, we're going to have to obey God. And of course, that's according to every person's conscience, right? Because there's some things that are not specifically spelled out, right? But we are obligated to ignore or refuse or comply with the law of our government if it violates a specific law. Not your opinions, but if it violates a specific law, so which could be a violation of the first commandment or the second commandment or the fourth commandment or whatever, right? So we're going to have to stop there. But remember those 4 principles of interpretation, and I'll bring them up.